Today we're going to discuss the chiaroscuro technique. It's a method for applying value to a two-dimensional piece of work to create the illusion of three-dimensional solid form. And today in class we discuss the difference between shape and form. And when we're drawing this out, this is really how we give the illusion of form. So let's start out with the technique. Let's start with the first component, which is the highlight. The highlight is the lightest value that you demonstrate in the object. This is where the direct light source is hitting. Then we have light. As the surface of your object curves, it does not get as much light, so the value becomes slightly darker. Then we have shadow. Once the surface curves away from the light source, it doesn't receive any direct light, but it does get some indirect light from the surroundings. That's why it's not completely black yet, and it's just in shadow. Then we have something called reflected light. And reflected light is a light that is bounced off of a surface and the surroundings, making the value slightly lighter here. So you would think right where you get to the edge of the sphere, it would be the darkest, but it's actually light because it's reflecting off the ground. And the last part of this technique is the cast shadow. The cast shadow is the darkest in value, but the further it goes out from the object, the lighter it gets. So it's the darkest where it's closest to the object. And you'll see in this that the artist used a value scale because that's where it really comes in handy. If you know that your cast shadow near the edge should be the darkest, you're going to make sure that it kind of represents this value scale. If you know that you have your highlight up here on the top, it should definitely be the lightest thing in your drawing. And that's how you use the chiaroscuro method. To ensure you really understand the chiaroscuro method of shading, what I'm going to ask you to do is go to this progress check-in slides. The first thing you want to do is find your name here and click on the link associated with it so it takes you to your denoted slide. The next thing you're going to do is add your name to your slide up here just to ensure you're in the right location. Then you're going to consider this sphere that has been sketched out here. The artist made a shape of a circle into a sphere of form. What you're going to do is label each component with the proper vocabulary. All you have to do is drag the arrow to where you believe it's being shown on the sketched out image. You're going to do this for all 5 arrows. The next thing you're going to do is look at the value scale swatches that have been provided for you and move them into the locations you believe they are demonstrated in. Think about the lightest part of this sketch. Where is it? And drag it so that the arrow is pointed in the right location. If you need to rotate things, please feel free to do so with the rotation option here. The last thing you're going to do for this part of the activity is bring your light source to where you believe it should be located in relation to the highlights and shadows of this image. Is the light source on the left, on the right, high, or low? Please make sure you resize and you move as you see fit for this sketch. And that's what you're doing for part 1 of today. So for the last part of today's activity, we're really going to consider this chiaroscuro method to add shading to objects that are near a light source. So I'm showing this on Photoshop again, but most of you are going to be doing this on traditional pencil and paper. First thing you should do is lay out your paper landscape, meaning width-wise would be longer. The next thing you're going to do is decide where you want your light source. It should be clearly definable, so we should either see a light bulb, a lantern, whatever, a street light, whatever form of light you're going to be using, but it should be clearly denoted on your page. It also helps to have a horizon line, helps you kind of just frame your composition. Then you're going to create your 3 forms. Now, we're asking for you to have at least 2 variations of forms. For example, you can have a cube and a cylinder, a cube and a sphere and a cylinder, but as long as there's 2 distinct ones, and you're going to create 3 forms in general in your composition. So you'll see here I have a cylinder and I have 2 cubes in my composition. Some things to keep in mind is that you have a clear definable light source, so your cast shadows are going to go in a certain direction. If my light source is coming from the right, then my cast shadow is probably going to be on the far left of this object and not on the right side. So some helpful hints to kind of frame your cast shadows are to think about how your light and your ground are meeting. So let's take the bottom of this cube. And let's say this is the ground from where this lantern is, and I'm just going to line it up with the bottom of this cube here. And I'm going to do the same with the top. And I'm thinking about where the light is kind of beaming down. And where these interact are kind of a good place for me to consider creating a cast shadow, because they're obviously going to extend out pretty far and connect this way. So I'm just going to take a pencil and sketch out my cast shadow. So I have the frame of where my cast shadow will probably extend to. I'm also going to consider the fact that most of the time, the darkest part of my cast shadow is the thing closest to my shape or form. So as I go outward, I'm going to get lighter. So this will probably be the darkest value in my cast shadow. And I can layer that with pencil, and kind of as I go out, I'm getting a little lighter. And this is where your value scale really comes in handy, right? Because you can consider how light or dark this value is going to be. Remember, there are 5 different components of this technique that you have to consider. So I did my cast shadow. There's also something called my highlight, which might be the easiest thing to consider because it'll probably be on the top of this cube because the light looks like it's hitting it pretty strongly. So I can kind of do a lighter value up here if I'd like, with some shading. And this is not going to be the darkest part of the box, right? This is probably going to be the lightest part of the cube, forgive me, right? But maybe the right side, which is not getting any direct light. If you look at these little lines I created here, it's indirect light. So this is probably going to be a bit darker. So I can kind of put a little more pressure on my pencil and do this side of my cube darker than the top. And this would be considered my shadow. I'll also have some shadow here where there's not direct light, so I can consider that as well and shade that in. Again, you're going to shade this in a lot better than me, and you're going to fill in each corner. But then you also have to remember the last part, which is the reflected light, where there's a little lightness that kind of bounces back on the shape right above the cast shadow. So I might have this little section right at the bottom of my cube that has a little bit of reflected light popping through. And I'm going to shade to the best of my ability, clean up the edges, and I'm going to repeat this technique for all the forms on my document. And you should have 3 in total. Really think about the 5 different components of the shadow: the highlight, the light, the shadow, the reflected light, and the cast shadow as you're creating this today. You're going to be submitting your final product as a photograph to Google Classroom. Good luck.